everybody. Welcome back to English 247. And this is for our class for Thursday, the 2nd of July, our last formal class before our final examination, which will be next Tuesday. And what I will do is I will post our exam at 9 a.m. on Tuesday, the time in which our class would normally meet if it were a face-to-face class. And you have 24 hours in which to complete that examination. Send it back to me via email, much like you've been doing with your papers. An open book, open note essay exam, so feel free to use the resources that you have over the course of the semester, the class videos, the class discussion, form responses, your own writings, and the hope is that the final gives you an opportunity to synthesize everything that we've been talking about over the course of the semester. And I think it's appropriate that we are ending this semester the way we began the semester with Kate Chopin. And I'm hopeful that by this point in the semester, you're a little bit more familiar with some of the many themes that were discussed by female authors during the 1800s, and also that you are a little bit more familiar with finding some of the literary elements of the text that we've been discussing. As you know, one of my goals in this class is for us to learn how to read literature so that we could approach a text on our own and be able to make some sense of it. And in terms of The Awakening, it's in some ways rather similar to the story of An Hour, but it was so bold, and may I suggest it is so bold, even in today's day, that it led to Kate Chopin being blacklisted. What we've got is a central female character who's experiencing an emotional, a spiritual, and a physical awakening. So the sexual aspect is one of the things that was considered to be so scandalous for the time. And Chopin herself lived a pretty unorthodox life. She didn't care for parties. She would oftentimes read literature. She smoked cigars, which is considered to be somewhat unusual for even today's day. She would spend time alone. We spent enough time over the semester talking about how all of these things would be seen as taboo for female. She insisted on her privacy, she dressed unconventionally, and she ran the family plantation after her husband's death. And that said, in terms of thinking about Kate Chopin and her life, at least according to the scholarship we have, she had a fulfilling marriage. Of course, you never know exactly the kind of lifestyle that somebody had. But certainly we know that in her writing, she would oftentimes talk about the female repression of her time period and themes of the importance of self-assertion and independence. And I wanted to just highlight some of the major pieces that I hope you've been able to identify on your own in this novella, which means it is longer than a short story, but it is not as long as a novel, and it is divided up into different books. And in the first book, we get the imagery of a caged bird. And of course, we know how birds are oftentimes used as symbols for female, that a bird can be entrapped or can be released. This caged bird is trapped and is also speaking an incomprehensible language. The idea is that the bird symbolizes Edna herself and that nobody really understands what it is that she's trying to say. And the bird, we get the translation of get out. And of course, this is a message for Edna. And this is also Edna expressing a message. We see her swimming without her wedding rings. This symbolizes freedom for Edna. The idea of swimming, water is cleansing. Also, the idea that the water can represent the womb and Edna is returning back. We see in book 3 that her husband, Mr. Pontellier, is disappointed his wife is not interested in his concerns and is not more attentive to the children. We know those were the expectations for female at the time. In fact, he looked forward to leaving the family for the excitement of work in the city. We're introduced to Edna as they are vacationing. So, this is a family that has a certain amount of economic comfort and goes to the city and is able to engage intellectually with others, while the idea is that female, much like Edna, should stay behind and take care of the children. But Edna breaks a lot of the expectations for female in this time period. And we are exposed to other female characters. For instance, in book 4, Madame Ratignolle. And she has trouble selecting a bonbon, thinking that it might be too rich and hurt her. That's what's considered daring for the female of the time period. So you can only imagine how daring Edna would seem. We know that Edna begins to realize her position as an independent being and begins her awakening because of the ocean, the sea, which cleanses and rejuvenates. It also caresses, offers freedom, escape. Also, lots of sexual imagery associated with it, with the tides going in and out. We know that even minor actions can possibly have symbolic significance. So we see in book 7, Edna removes her collar, for instance, and opens her dress at the throat, which is representing freedom. And we learn a little bit about her marriage, and it's basically not one that's based on emotion. It was one that was based on a good match. We talked about this when we talked about persuasion. And that she's fond in an uneven way of her children. Imagine saying that in today's world about one's children. That would be considered scandalous, especially scandalous during the 1800s. And we know that Edna meets a woman named Mademoiselle Reisz, who is a very different kind of woman who defies many of the expectations of the time period. She's unmarried, she's independent, and she is involved in the arts. And the arts are portrayed as a way for women to have self-expression. And Mademoiselle Reisz plays Chopin. This is another Chopin. This is the musician's Chopin. So there's a little bit of a pun here. Edna is struck by the passion of the music, and that's one of the things that Edna is realizing, that there is no passion in her life. Comfort? Sure, especially after we compare it to something like Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. But the idea is that all of these women are trying to achieve more based on the life situations that they have been involved in over their lives. And we can't necessarily blame somebody for wanting to achieve more. It usually is part of the human condition. Though there is a difference between trying to achieve your physical freedom, as we saw with Harriet Jacobs, and trying to achieve your intellectual and emotional freedom, as we're seeing with Edna Pontellier. I think it's quite interesting when she learns how to swim, because this is supposed to be an example of her taking power and authority. And note that all of the men are taking credit for teaching her how to swim. I think that's quite telling. And then we see in book 11 how Edna and her husband are having a battle of wills over who will go inside the house first. Obviously, it's a battle about power. At this point, Mr. Pontellier wins, but in the end, we see how Edna exerts her authority. In book 13, we see how she takes a nap and has a sexual awakening while stretching out in bed, that all of a sudden she feels her physicality. And then she awakes hungry, physically hungry, literally, but also figuratively. She's hungry for more in her life. And of course, we know that as Edna's been vacationing, she's been spending a good amount of time with Robert, and she's developed an infatuation, which turns into more than an infatuation. And she's quite upset when she learns that Robert is leaving town. Edna realizes at this point that she has emotion in a way that she doesn't have for her own husband, for Robert. And one of the things that Edna says, which I think is quite telling in book 16, is that she would never sacrifice herself to anyone, even her children, although she would give up her life for them. I find that to be a fascinating quote, that it's possible to still give up your life, but not necessarily sacrifice yourself. I think that's something that Harriet Jacobs also was thinking in terms of the way that she chose to live her life. In book 17, Edna refuses to take callers on Tuesday afternoons. Imagine how scandalous this would be in the world of persuasion. Mr. Pontellier keeps trying to season his bland soup, which represents his bland life. Edna tries to throw away her wedding ring, which of course represents marriage. The maid returns it to her. The idea that Edna cannot escape her marriage. And Edna talks about how she doesn't envy at all the domestic harmony of other married couples and other families, such as the Ragnolis. Edna wants something different than what society has offered for female. And she is, in some ways, almost like in the story of an hour, learning that she needs and wants something different. And of course, as the novel progresses, or the novella, I should say, Mr. Pontellier is shocked and angered that Edna is disregarding her duties as a wife and a mother. And his first go to is perhaps she's mentally unstable. And if you'll remember when we saw the documentary about Emily Dickinson, there was references to this trope about the mad woman in the attic, which is actually something that we saw with Jane Eyre with Bertha. So the idea that if a woman didn't follow the expectations of the time, she must be insane. Edna learns that Robert is writing letters to Mademoiselle Reisz about her, which of course piques Edna's interest because Edna is still infatuated at least, or even in love with Robert. Mr. Pontellier decides to visit a physician to see if there's a way they can, quote, cure, unquote, his wife. And he says that his wife is making him, quote, uncomfortable, unquote. And because she's not following, well, what we have already discussed over the course of the semester with the Cult of True Womanhood. The doctor wonders if perhaps another man is involved, but out of decorum, he won't state his concerns out loud. We know the importance of manners and decorum with persuasion. We saw some of this in Jane Eyre, for instance, when Mrs. Fairfax was giving Jane Eyre instructions about how to act when somebody enters into a room because there are social rules in place. Edna's breaking all of those social rules. And she even admits that she's happy her husband is often at work, because if they were at home, what could they possibly talk about with one another? So there isn't any kind of emotional or intellectual connection with them. Edna's father even thinks that Edna's husband is being too lenient with Edna because she's not living up to the expectations of female. What is Edna doing? She's spending a lot of time alone. Who knows what could happen when you're alone? And she has the leisure to read. And that's something that we've talked about all semester long, about how dangerous reading can be. Edna starts spending time with a new male friend, Mr. Arabin. He's also infatuated with Edna, and Edna's first thought is, what would Robert think of this relationship? Not what her husband would think of this relationship. Eventually, Edna decides to move out on her own. Again, think about how scandalous this would seem in this time period. She's going to rent and move into a small house that's known as the Pigeon House. More bird imagery here. Around the corner that she can afford on her own because she has a small inheritance, so she has some economic security, and she's also generating some income from her own art, from her sketches. So, of course, economic opportunity allows female to have a certain level of independence and power. And when Edna finds out that Robert is returning, she's quite pleased. This is when she finally admits that she loves him. And Edna even admits she knows her character would be viewed as wicked, but that's not going to stop her actions. And when Arabin, not her husband, not Robert, Arabin kisses her and she feels passion, they consummate their relationship. And Edna's biggest regret is that her lover is not Robert, not that she has committed adultery in her marriage. In book 30, Edna turns 29, a pivotal time, especially for female, even in today's age, but especially in the 1800s. We saw some of this in Persuasion as well, that women are starting to lose their bloom, so to speak, by the ending of the 20s. And this is where Mr. Pontellier learns about his wife's intentions to move out, and his primary concern is what will the neighbors think? And perhaps they will think that he's experiencing a financial decline. Again, I can't help but reference Persuasion. We began with the Elliot family and their concerns that it would seem as if they were experiencing financial difficulties if they moved out and didn't rent to the right person, whoever the right person is. Robert eventually returns to town and sees Arabin's picture at Edna's house. He's jealous. Edna kisses Robert now at this point, and they finally admit their love for one another. And Edna is summoned to Madame Ratignolli's house because she's pregnant, Madame Ratignolli, and the way she's supposed to be during the timetable that would be expected for female. Madame Ratignolli is quite aware that Edna has been tempted by Robert and wants Edna to witness that birth. Not that Madame needs assistance, but wants to remind Edna about her responsibility to her children. And when Edna returns home after that episode, Robert is left, leaving a note saying goodbye because he loves her, because he doesn't want to compromise her position as a married woman. And the book ends with Edna saying she can't sacrifice herself for her children. Remember her earlier quote where she says she couldn't sacrifice herself for anybody, not even her children, but she could sacrifice her life. A little bit of foreshadowing of how this novel ends. She undresses, goes into the sea naked. The idea here that she's loose of all constraints. She swims until she is exhausted. We aren't told exactly what happens, but if you swim out in the water until you're too exhausted to swim anymore, you drown. So she's committed suicide because she realizes that society is never going to accept a woman like her. It doesn't matter if she's with Robert or she's with Arabin or she's with her husband. The expectation is that she be with somebody who is male and that somebody will have a certain level of control over her, which is something that she escapes through death. And if this reminds you of Story of an Hour, that's exactly what it should remind you of. After all, it's written by the same author. So we've seen how we've gone from some subtle commentary about female to some very blunt commentary about female and lack of voice and repression and suppression in the 1800s. So for today's last attendance question, which will be due on Sunday the 5th, because the 4th, Saturday, when it would normally be due, is the 4th of July. So I'm going to give you an additional day. What do you think is the most scandalous act in The Awakening and why? And trust me, there are quite a few scandalous acts, obviously. And as you know, with these questions, no right or wrong, I'm more interested in your thinking. And while you're not required to respond to your classmates, you're certainly encouraged to. But what you are required to do is to read your classmates' responses and my responses in turn. So to end the class with The Awakening seems to be appropriate, as I had said, because we began the class with A Story of an Hour, both written by the same author. But outside of my breaking the chronology at the beginning of the semester with A Story of an Hour, which I used as a kind of example of how to go about reading literature, we've been going in chronological order. So, with that said, what's left is paper number 2, which should be devoted to one of the later texts in the semester. So that would probably mean either Jane Eyre or Emily Dickinson, though writing about poetry is a very different kind of thing than writing about, let's say, a short story or writing about a novel. Or perhaps you would want to write on incidents in the life of a slave girl. Or lastly, perhaps you would want to write The Awakening. And that paper is due on the last day of class, so that is Tuesday. The idea is that you have finished that paper and submitted it before Tuesday at 9 a.m. so that you can devote yourself entirely to that essay final. So with that said, I will leave you with writing your paper and give you some time to contemplate what you think is the most scandalous act in The Awakening and why. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next week with the final examination. Take care. Bye bye.